Hello, and welcome back to the fourth episode in the first day of the Stalingrad campaign. A little recap from last time. The Germans have finally been able to move up and capture a pair of stone locations, but otherwise have not been able to accomplish too much. They've also killed off a crew that belonged to an AT gun, so their armored forces are relatively safe at the moment. I should probably point out that the roll I make at the start, if you don't know what it's for weather purposes. I know some people that I've played against, anyways, that and sometimes just a general consensus, I guess, don't feel that the weather roll is all that important. But realistically, when it does happen, it drastically changes how the game plays out. The simple fact that you can have a direction change when it comes to wind, which applies to the smoke that's currently on the battlefield, gusts, which thankfully there's already a blaze on the map, and I believe it's only 2 hexes away. I'd have to check that. I'm sure it'll be relevant at some point. But when you have fire that spreads, it can spread to buildings. Those buildings can become engulfed in flames, and so on and so forth. It gets rather crazy. Another thing that I've always enjoyed, more as trivia, just because I've never been able to have that happen to me, is overcast. So if weather changes to a different temperature, if the weather changes to different weather, such as say rain or overcast, snow, that sort of thing, it obviously has an effect on how far your units can move or what they can see and so forth. So you always want to make sure that you remember about the weather roll. For example, I rolled an 11, and normally that wouldn't do anything. But if there was an overcast currently, that could generate a lightning strike. And again, that's the kind of fun trivia I like to know about certain rules. And lightning strike rules get really crazy, and it's super involved, probably more so than even artillery. But at the end of the day, it makes for nice storytelling. The rally phase doesn't seem to have really done anything for the Russians, unfortunately. That's kind of to be expected. One we've seen time and time again on the broken side of Russian forces, they don't have the very best of rally chances. Their broken morale is usually very low in comparison with other major nations. So as soon as a unit breaks, you kind of have a higher likelihood with the Russians specifically of that sort of cascading degradation of your forces. We can see that at least one broken unit, or actually the two ones that we see, have a broken morale of 5. Once you add a desperation morale on there, it's practically impossible. You still want to roll for them just in case you get heat of battle. Although, you can choose to ignore that if you want. But again, the biggest thing to note, anyways, is that the lack of any good chances to recover your broken units right away just makes it really painful for the defenders here. You're effectively going an entire turn without being able to do anything with that unit. Even more so if you don't route them to a location that offers them any sort of protection. and then you reapply Desperation Morale, and you have to wait another turn, and so on. Speaking of turns, since I'm still going through some rally rolls here, another thing to remember is that when it comes to campaign games, and technically this also applies to certain scenarios, but not all of them, we can see on the turn track on the right side of the map, usually that's something you just put on top in the non-play area. But for campaigns, they usually add it on the map itself. Campaign games, especially this one, well, let me rephrase that. In this campaign game specifically, you can see that on the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th turn, there's a circled number on the top right corner of the box. That circled number is effectively there to determine if the game will suddenly end. If that day suddenly takes a turn for the worst, everybody's and whoever's the aggressor says we've done enough, or we've taken too many casualties or whatever, we'll stop. The main reason for it to exist, as far as I can think of anyways, is basically to give the Russians a bit of fighting chance. But it also works both ways in the case of if the Russians decide to be on the offensive. Although generally you won't see that as nearly as much as the Germans. The only requirement you need to do to end a game early is that at the end of the defending player's turn, so at the end of the full turn, you basically roll one dice after everything's done at the end of the turn, and if you happen to get that number that's in the printed circle or less, you end the turn. You end the game. So obviously, turn 8th, you can't roll anything higher than a 6 because it's only one dice that you roll. So that's why there's the end marker there. The end marker afterwards is just in case you happen to get to 5, 6, or 7, and you end there. You just put a marker on the end square, just as a sort of reminder. Makes it easier that way. All right. And here's where we can see a heat of battle. I think this might be the first one. Definitely the first one for a rally. And this is what I was talking about. There is absolutely... there's nothing that... how do I put this? Nothing can prevent a heat of battle from occurring. So when you roll a heat of battle, it doesn't matter if there's plus 12 on the dice roll modifier. It will always be successful, period. Once you roll a heat of battle, you then consult the little table. Basically, you roll a second dice roll with both die, and then you modify it by whatever DRM modifiers we can see on the bottom left of the IFT table we're looking at. Technically, it's two separate tables, but the vassal puts them in the same window. So the unit was broken, so there's a +1. There's nothing for Germans. They don't get a minus or a plus. And that's basically it. Wounded doesn't modify it, and there's no other modifiers that would apply. So you roll a second dice roll, and then whatever you get effectively generates whatever the result is. It is possible to create a hero as well as battle hardening on a 5 or a 6, but otherwise all the results are separate. If you're curious as to how you generate a hero, because under normal circumstances you effectively have somebody in a squad or half squad, whichever it is, and a crew as well. It depends on basically who's rolling. But a hero creation, you get a hero unit, which is seen as something completely apart. You're basically generating a new unit, and the hero, in effect, can you basically act as a separate unit, which can do a bunch of other cool stuff, which is pretty fun. If you happen to have a leader, though, who's already just one person, obviously you don't have like mitosis or whatever, he can't just clone himself. That leader is considered as becoming a heroic leader, which has some extra stuff that applies to it. In this instance, it's actually really nice that this guy goes berserk. Berserk is generally seen to me anyways. I don't see it as being a terribly good bonus, because when you have a unit go berserk, effectively what needs to be done is you have to immediately charge on your move phase. You have to charge the nearest known enemy unit. It can be really cool, especially because a berserk unit has a higher morale value. They effectively have like 10 morale, which is really good. And even though you're charging a unit, because you have that high morale, you can take a lot of punishment, and it kind of negates the factor of your units blindly charging into an area. Now, I don't recall if crews can actually berserk. I suppose it's possible, because I don't know anything that would state otherwise. But the basic gist, and as to why everybody is attempting berserk, is because when a leader goes berserk, that leader automatically attempts to berserk everybody in his stack. And a unit that successfully passes a berserk check automatically rallies. So it's like really good when a leader actually goes berserk, in my opinion, anyways. Another thing that's interesting when it comes to a leader that goes berserk is that if you happen to have a leader who's not, even if they're not rallying, I don't think I'm allowed to make this. Oh no, I can make this rally roll. So a leader that rallies or that gets heat of battle and goes berserk can berserk anybody in that same location, I believe, even if the other units aren't the same, or aren't a target of the same attack as what the leader I guess survived or was attacked by. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that a leader that goes berserk cannot apply his dice roll modifier. So in this instance where I have an 8 down 1 leader, that leader cannot apply his -1 modifier. So obviously if it happens on a 10 down 3 leader, you'd prefer not to get a berserk result on him. But otherwise it's I always think it's pretty handy. I don't see anything that makes it so crews couldn't berserk, so yeah, I think I'd have to look that up a little bit more, maybe ask a question somewhere online, because I feel like they should, but also it seems kind of weird for a crew to go berserk. Anyways, the obvious overall benefit of this is that I get a lot of units back. I took berserk off of all of those units because, again, the LOS thing that has not yet been, I guess, discovered by myself. So technically, those units would have been able to see not only the units in I6 on the second level, but also the hidden units on the second level of P6. Both are second level building locations. So I should have, or technically first level, but anyways, I should have been able to see them. So Um, if I was not under that sort of error, what I would have done is checked out which is the closest of the two, and then those Germans, one would have shot at them this turn because they can't move, but on their next turn, they would have moved towards them, whichever was closest. Another great thing about Berserk is that you might think that, oh, that really sucks because they charged their target that they initially saw. What happens if in their charge they see somebody else that happens to be closer? You can thankfully change that, change their charge target. So you can then modify it, go to the next unit, and so on and so forth. Now, if you happen to not see anybody, or you're in for whatever reason, where you berserked, you cannot see anybody, you remove the berserk, but you keep all the benefits of having rallied. The fact that you can't see anybody doesn't negate the fact that you berserked in the first place. Once again, there's not much for me to really do as the Russians with these two guys in the wooden buildings. I don't want to move them out, because if I move them out, I feel like I'm just going to give away a bunch of territory. And the fact that the Germans now have an MMG with a unit, in M3, they should be able to cover any sort of retreat if I don't go the quote-unquote right way. So I don't feel like running southeast just to try and do a big loop and get west. And at the same time, those guys, because of their position, actually makes it really good where they are right now. We've seen that they've taken some really good shots, done some damage to the German push, and so, yeah, there's no reason to really give that up. Luckily, I didn't cower there because I do have a leader that's assigned with that machine gun. So we're looking at a 6 firepower. Actually, it might be 8 if the other guy, if the crew or half squad shot with it, and then the down 2. So it's really good. Fortunately for the Germans, they're not going to have a unit break so easily. But the sniper activates. And technically, I'm not doing the random sniper activation properly, because you should roll a dice, and if it's 1 to 3, you use the western sniper, and if it's 4 to 6, you use the eastern one. I just picked whichever got the better dice roll. Again, here, because the sniper landed in an area between 3 units, you pick the one with the worst terrain effect modifier. In this case, there are 2 such examples. The Hex in B2 has debris, and it's only a +1, and the Hex in C4 is also just debris with a +1. The Russians would prefer not having a guy that can put some fire closer than what that mortar can do, especially since the mortar doesn't have any line of sight, and I've already gone over the troubles of using that one. You might be curious as to why I'm shooting again, and it seems to be under the same parameters, and that's because the heavy machine gun, I believe it is, has retained its rate of fire. This is one of the main bonuses to machine guns, and it's why you always want to roll low. Obviously, this game is always built around that, but that's like the main benefit you can ever have with that sort of weapon. It's also why you want to get yourself into a position with those machine guns in order to constantly use them over and over and over again, because that sort of benefit is definitely something you want to take advantage of as much as possible anyways. So The rules specifically state that on a K result, um, what happens is and there's still rate of fire because the rate of fire I think is a 2 on that machine gun. So on a K dash or slash number result, what happens is you randomly select one unit, and that unit gets automatically gets casualty reduced. So if it's a full squad, it goes down to a half squad, etc. These guys from Rifle Company B were unfortunately not so lucky. Anyways, so on a K dash result, you casualty reduce one unit by random selection. If units are tied, whichever ones that tied get higher and tied, they get casualty reduced together. And then every unit, even the one that just got casualty reduced, suffers a morale check. So there are plenty of ways for you to have a full squad that gets casualty reduced by random selection and then immediately fails its morale check and breaks. And then you put a little bit of extra firepower on them, and you might have even worse stuff happen to them. Unfortunately for the Russians, they weren't able to eliminate that one squad. This is... I think I really didn't do a good job with my placement on that machine gun specifically. At the end of the day, I don't particularly like the placement because I can't... I think my goal was to have them in that house so I could clear... There's 2 fire lanes you can see in northwestern and northeastern direction. I really felt like I could box the Germans in with a gun there and prevent them from getting the open ground if my far left flank crumbled, or if I decided to either give way on the right or lose units on the right. That would be like a good anchor. But unfortunately, the machine gun's just a 4 firepower, which isn't very strong. And on top of that, the fact that I rolled an 11 on the IFT roll broke the gun. So now that machine gun is completely worthless, and I can't do anything with it. Obviously, that's all up to random chance with regards to the break. But breakage or not, so far the machine gun just hasn't had much use. Here I'm just checking basically what or where I want to shoot. There's a couple of shots that unfortunately didn't do anything, just a series of bad rolls. If you're getting a cowering on 8 with a 4 firepower attack, you're probably not going to do much. Although, again, you never know. If you get like snake eyes, you still cower. Yeah. Also rolling a lot of 4s, much to the chagrin of the Germans. Although they've rolled a bunch themselves as well. I know it's probably going to be a little confusing to keep seeing the infantry fire table display on certain rolls anyways, when it displays, Allied SAN and German SAN, that sort of thing, or Axis SAN really. But unfortunately there's no way to modify that other than just removing that value from the info tab for the game setup. But honestly, if you're doing that, you just open yourself up to a lot of issues, because especially when playing the board game version, the actual physical version, I have forgotten time and time again about sniper activations. And in games on Vassal, if I don't put the info in, I always forget about snipers. There's just something about it that maybe I'm just not quite remembering when it's supposed to activate, or there's something subconscious there. I think because yeah, it's just it becomes a pain to try and remember. So at this point, on the defensive, it's hard to game yourself, but I really feel like the Germans don't have much in the way of being able to break out from the north central position. All that debris is making it's just more time consuming for them to get out, and the Russians still have a bunch of guys that are all hidden, which really makes it tough for the Germans to just advance and then start taking shots. If I had a lot of units with assault fire, I'd probably take the chance with it. Assault move into the debris next to the wall, and then try to shoot into the stone locations. Or, better yet, get my artillery and take a chance at just dropping artillery on a non-pre-registered hex and go from there. It's just not very ideal for the Germans right now to push there. So I'm putting a little bit more emphasis on the western side, and as the Russian player, again, because it's really hard to game yourself, so I'm basically trying to flood or take units from, I guess, a rear line on the eastern side and pass them through the south into the west, and hopefully prevent any sort of breakthroughs. Again, the biggest issue that the Russian player will have is that you're trying to prevent the Germans from getting stone locations. The Germans can control nearly 100% of the board if they wanted to, but if they don't have those stone locations, then it does not matter. They're not accomplishing their objective. So, even if it's just putting a unit that's concealed in an area that would be that would prevent the Germans from capturing it, or just making it tough for them to do anything. Again, that's kind of the biggest hurdle you want to be for them. Unless something catastrophic happens, you're generally expecting to, as the Russians, to basically constantly be delaying the Germans as much as possible. Another thing that I don't do, and it's one of those things that I'll probably start doing more and more as the second day rolls around. There's a couple of things that I've obviously missed or forgotten about, so don't worry too much about how these pre-recorded videos are playing, because how I go through it is subject to change, and I'm always trying to improve myself when it comes to ASL play, even if it's just against myself. However, all to say that in the second day there will be things that will come into play a lot more. For example, at the end of a player turn, that player is allowed to conceal units under certain conditions. Basically regain that question mark and make it that much harder to be shot. Because again, if your unit is concealed, you're having you take whatever firepower is shooting at you and you divide it by 2, which is really strong, especially when it comes to really heavy stuff, especially like artillery and so on. Well, maybe not necessarily artillery, but if you try to set up what's called a doom stack or a death stack, it becomes that much less effective if their firepower is divided by 2. So in this instance, say like in the last turn with the Germans, at the end of the turn, I would have been able to conceal the mortar carrying unit in hex B2, because there's nobody that could see them. Nobody has line of sight that can trace into that hex. You might be wondering, Well, there is a couple units at the second level, in terms of like on the factory hexes and in the building, that we keep seeing over in I6. Yeah, I6. Um, Buildings cause a blind hex behind them, depending on the line of sight. And this is why line of sight gets like really confusing for people. So if you don't adhere to it completely, I can totally understand why. But yeah, you can regain concealment that way. In some instances, you have to roll a dice for it, and if you get below a certain result, you regain concealment that way rather than getting it automatically. Again, it's really handy to actually keep that in mind as well. There's one of the people I play with always tends to forget about concealment, concealment gain specifically, and I have to admit, it makes a lot of my shots that much easier, because there's never anything to really have to worry about. There's also, since there's a little bit of downtime here, looking at all the units I want to move and not move, there's a couple mistakes I have made in this video. Obviously, playing a game like this is kind of to be expected. I think it's just the way that it displays on the map. You get a lot of stuff, so it starts to get a little confusing. That trench should not block line of sight. So technically, I believe there's at least one. There's at least one unit that would have lost concealment when going into I8, and there's probably a shot or two it could have made as they were moving around that fortunately for the Russians I did not do. I don't know specifically why I was worried about the current turn stuff with the info table or whatever. So at this point, it's defensive fire for the Germans. There was, unfortunately for them, not much to really shoot at, just because all the movement was kind of out of sight. That being said, another mistake I make with the artillery always comes in first. I don't think that's a negotiable thing. When a phase of a turn begins, where the artillery is applicable, so prep fire if it's that player's artillery, or defensive fire if it's that player's artillery, then again, you have to do that first. I think in the last video we saw the kind of fix that I did to the bad draws I made, or unless that was the 2 videos ago, but hopefully that won't happen once again. So I'm taking pot shots at this point with the tank, because hell, if you got tanks on the map, you should always be using them no matter what. I don't quite know why I rolled an IFT afterwards, because I don't think that tank would have been able... Oh, I think it's because I was just automatically declaring the coaxial machine gun to go with it. And again, you're allowed to make separate attacks if you want those machine guns. So, aside from if you don't want to lose acquisition, which isn't... I mean, it's important, but it's not the end of the world if you miss out on it. Definitely something you should take advantage of when it comes to vehicles. So I'm going to do this really large attack. Fire groups are interesting in that you can bunch up a bunch of units. You can get like as much firepower as those two hexes or two locations can contain. But one thing to remember is that even though I have an 9 down 1 leader, that he doesn't get to apply his -1. Because it's a fire group and you need a leader in every hex or every location that a fire group participates in when it comes to the attack, and it always picks the worst result. So, or the worst modifiers to say. So even though there was a 9 down 1 leader and a 8 down 0, or just a straight 8 leader, because the worst leader was just a -0, you don't get any sort of modifier there. I think at this point in time, I'm starting to realize, like, oh yeah, right, I can shoot from, first floor to second floor, but I don't think I've quite yet recalled that I can do that for my guys and my debris. Unfortunately for me, the fact that these buildings are fortified means that on a normal roll of 7, you're basically adding 3 for the stone building and an extra 1 for the fortification of that building. So you really have to roll low for those fortified buildings, and it's also why as the Russians, you want to put an emphasis on protecting those things. This is kind of the main issue when it comes to attacking for me, because I still haven't completely gotten out of the habit of dropping smoke somewhere before attacking it. Obviously sometimes you just don't have the opportunity to do so. But I always seem to have terrible luck when it comes to attacks on heavily fortified positions, even when I have 30 firepower, 36 firepower going towards it. This is kind of another good example of that. Getting an unfortunate 11, even with like 8 or 12 firepower, or whatever it was there. I actually forget if in the video I forgot to put final fire counter on that guy. Apparently I guess I assume I didn't. Or that he didn't shoot, I should say. There's another example of a morale check that equals the unit's morale, and therefore they get pinned. Again, pin's actually really important, more so on the attacking player than it is the defending player, specifically for the no move and no advance. Now, move might be an issue if obviously that unit is attempting to move in the first place. But any unit that gets caught by a pin, I can't get that guy to safety now. Because under normal circumstances, I probably would have seeded the E10 hex. Because one, it's debris, so it's not a stone location. It doesn't really matter if I keep it or not. But more importantly, I prevent him from getting shot by like 15 firepower in the next turn, if I so choose to do so with the German Sturm Company guys over there. And because, again, you're forcing the Germans to come to me, or to the Russians, I guess it's technically me anyways, because you're forcing the Germans to get closer and closer and closer, the full firepower that the Russians can yield is just, comes into play more. Honestly, though, because we're now in the advanced fire, there's not much I can really do as the Russians. Everywhere that I moved units doesn't really have anything to look at. So I'm still just kind of stuck with bad quote-unquote shots that there's not much I can really do for. In hindsight, I probably should have had that guy in the fortified location shoot straight north, just because that's just a better shot. A tank does add a +1 to hindrance, so keep that in mind if you ever shoot across a hex with a tank in it. So I'm starting to think I just completely forgot about artillery this turn. So the Russians can count themselves lucky, I guess. I guess it's technically true that you don't have to call in artillery, not unless there's the if you have the applicable setup for it. I guess, like if you have the fire for effect currently going on. But I think if I don't realize it in this video, I think I realize it rather soon. Like, oh right, I forgot about artillery, and then just I don't think I play it. So. I really should have broke that guy in, what is that, N0, and had him run away. One thing that you can do as a player, if you have a unit that's broken but with no desperation morale token on him, you can reapply that desperation morale so that he's forced to rout away. A unit without a DM counter doesn't have to rout away. Technically, a unit with a DM counter doesn't have to move either, other than if there's some other extraneous conditions to that. But under normal circumstances, if you have a DM on a unit, that's what allows you to move away. Yeah, the more and more I'm playing, or I'm rewatching, obviously these turns, it really does annoy me that I forgot completely about those machine guns on the second level. The group in, what is it, 09, I believe, especially those guys, I really should have thought about it more than I obviously did. There's just a lot of firepower there that wasn't used, and I mean, I guess in some way, if you guys are trying to play along, or if you're using this for ideas for your own stuff, definitely keep it in mind when setting up. Like, it's pretty important to have units that actually contribute to your defense, rather than just sit and look pretty and watch their friends get mutilated by bullets and explosions. I generally do advances in the quick and easy way, or the fast and easy way, but it is important to check how much it costs to get to a new location, because a unit that advances, and I believe if it takes all of its movement factors to get into a location, it becomes, I can't remember if it becomes CX or something else. I'd have to look it up again just to be sure, but definitely important to know. And because there's no close combat, nobody's in the same or sharing the same location, we go to the next turn. So I will see you then, and as always, thanks for watching.